and skunk soil. Some of the, and not lanolin, but mutton tallow, which lanolin is derived from. So if you had a cold, Mother was always on the job, and with something to break that cold up. We didn't know whether it was going to be a cold or whether it was going to be a grip. So if they thought you was going to be real sick or you had any touch of fever, they would commence to load you with quinine. We had quinine in bulk, a little bit of powder, and I know Father always used to measure it out on the small blade of his jackknife. It was bitter, and we didn't like to take it, but we took it because we'd rather have the quinine than we would being sick. Then it was followed by things that was hot, heat you up. The older ones and even the younger children, they would take boiling hot water as fast or as hot as you could drink, and they would put in about a tablespoon of whiskey in a whole cup of water and put sugar in it, and then you had to drink it. You had to be in bed. And then we had hot water bottles placed around us, mostly glass fruit jars around us with hot water. Now that idea was to getting the patient to sweat. Whenever you can sweat, you will break the grip. If the doctor comes, I remember later doctors coming and giving me pills that caused me to sweat. And then they'll say, well, that breaks the fever. It doesn't let the fever get started and get a hold of it. So we took usually hot water, and they would pile in jars and put around the patient, or Mother would, and then we would get in there and roast until we got sweating good. And sometimes your undershirt would be just wringing wet. And
how about your family during World War I? Did any of them get the flu?
Yes, I remember having it, and I remember we had Dr. Waters at that time. Eamon was dead, and Dr. Waters from Knowlesville came here, tied his horse out to the hitching post and stopped on the stoop and put a handkerchief over his nostrils. It's the only thing he could do to prevent it. And he came in, and he labeled out quinine and things like that. They did not have at that time, though, things that would knock out the serious fevers they had. When it got into pneumonia, they didn't have anything that would knock the pneumonia out at that time. So if you got pneumonia, your chances was only one in 2 or 3 that you would get through. That's what the most of them died with, not with that, but with pneumonia. They would change over into pneumonia. And that's what got the young and the old, because lots of people in the 20s died. It wasn't a disease of the elderly people. Everyone had it. And I can remember that when I got it, we had furnaces just been put in like that. And one thing, in addition to the other medicine we had, and that was skunk soil. That was something that you would rub on. Now that isn't the essence of skunk that you can remember, and by smelling. It had no smell at all. I've got some here in the house if you want to try some.
No thanks.
But that is good to rub on your chest. Mother always would put on a mustard plaster on there and almost burn you. Get the fire in there. Or I got the skunk soil and I poured my hand full like that, and I just rubbed my hand, just wet it, just as if it was water, and rubbed it on there. Got right down my hands and knees, and let that heat come and drive it in. And then when that would dry, I put some more on there. And then I went to bed and took all the other medicine. In the morning, my fever had been relieved. My chest was loosened up. And that was one of the things that they did. Now, we didn't have maybe as hard a case of this old grip, as we used to call it, as they do nowadays. Sometimes it's almost impossible to knock it out. But now, of course, they have good medicine, and they will dope you with pills and even in your blood if they want to catch you quick enough. But it's many of the diseases have been headed off by the doctors and their medicine. Now, I want to tell about another disease that I had, and another sickness that I had, because I haven't heard of one like this in a great many years. Back in the days when they cleared off the land, and the land was full of germs, as they used to call them, but they didn't call them germs as we think of them today. There was something in the soil, that this fresh soil was stirred up and the sun got to it. It would cause the people to have fever one day and severe chills the next day until you would just rattle. You couldn't hold still. And it was usually caught on new land. Father had 20 acres of new land down on the Kenyonville Road, and one year he broke it up. And I was just old enough, a young man, and I learned to plow down there on that old stony land down there. And I hadn't been plowing there very long. We would go down with two teams, one team on the wagon, another team tied behind. My team was tied behind, and I got plowed in the forenoon and got to dinner, and after dinner I laid down, and I commenced to shake, and I shook the wagon. And the man that was with me was named Kelly, Harry Kelly. He was the hired man. And he says, "I believe you're sick." And I says, "I'm sick. I know it." And he said, "Well, you better not go to work." Well, he went to work. He was way down there, and he wanted to do some plowing. And so he would plow a while. But in the middle of the afternoon, he said, "I believe I better take you home." So he took his team, put on the wagon. We came home, and he stopped at the house here, and he says, "I've got a sick boy in here." And the mother run out, and they got me into the house here and put me in this room in here to my right here. And I had fever, and they sent for the doctor to Gaines, but this time it was, I can't think of his name now. I'll think of it in just a minute. Well, the doctor, he came, and he didn't know what was the matter with me. He said, "Probably you've got the old fever and ague." But he said, "I don't know for certain." But he said, "I'll leave you some medicine." And he left me a lot of medicine. And now he says, "I'll come back early in the morning, and he will see what we can find out." And he came back in the morning. And he said, "Yes, that's what you got," he said. And he says, "I'll put you under quarantine, and you'll have to take my medicine." And so I was in there again, in the room there, and I remember it was in last of June that I was taken sick. And a 4th of July, it was a very hot day. The folks was outside, and they was having ice cream and things, and lemonade and things. It was cold. And I sat in there shaking with a fever. And I said, "You think it's warm?" I said, "How would you like to have a fever day?" But the medicine took a hold, and after a few days, the medicine got the better of the fever, and the fever died down. But something you didn't get over very quick. It took quite a little of your strength out of you, and your fever would die. We used to call it wearing the fever away. We wore the fever away, but it left you rather weak. And after it was nearly a month before I got back onto my feet, and got so I could get around and do any kind of work at all. Even then I couldn't plow, but I could do a few chores around. Now, is there any question you want to ask me?
Is that similar to the 24-hour virus, accepting it?
Well, I guess so. I don't know just what they call that. Usually it'll knock it out, things, if they can get here in time. They'll give you medicine. I had upstairs, I had Dr. Park. One of the first places he was, and when he came to Albin, was down here. And I was sick upstairs, and he gave me something it knocked me right out. And he got me sweating. He got here in the evening, and before midnight I was sweating good, and the next morning I was apparently over the worst of it, just as quick as that. But in other times you just had to wear it out. And lots of people in the olden days, when they came here, they didn't even have a doctor, so they had to. And if they were a frail person, wasn't strong, or anything the matter, or a woman that had just had a baby and was down in the flesh, or anything like that, they would. Next time, mine
Now,
is.
what about herbs? They used herbs, didn't they?
Yes, we had a few, but Mother wasn't much of an herb doctor. She had catnip for the cats, and she had a few herbs, but she didn't have anything that much. She used to raise sage for things, for the seasoning for the meat and things, but she was not a herb doctor. I'm going to take up the weddings, and now the next thing in the home.
Mr. Pratt, what else happened in the home that you can tell us?
Well, the home, we should call it a home because it was more than a house. It was a home in a great many different ways. All the events in your life seem to happen around the home. Now, in the olden times, we never went and had church weddings. They were unthought of when I was a child. And even I wasn't married in a church. Maybe that's why it didn't work the best. The weddings were in the home. Sometimes small weddings, only just the two families they were to be united would come. Where I was married, I think there was only 9 people there besides the minister. And my sister had a wedding in the home. And of course, my mother and father had a wedding in the home. Now it's go to the church and things. But the weddings was all small weddings. Not too many gifts given because we didn't invite many people. So you did not get very much. Sometimes they would give you things afterwards, though. But once in a while, even the country people, when I was small, took air on themselves. And I remember one wedding where one other girls that I'd been in school together, and she always had a pretty good idea that she was on the top shelf all the while. And she married a man that had a little money, so they had to have a wedding. So I'm going to tell you something about Edith Cleaver's wedding. She's passed away now, so she can't hear what I'm telling. They had a big wedding, a big house, and they had a nice wedding, and there was many people invited there. It was in the latter part of the day. It seems though it was 5 or 6 o'clock, the wedding, and then afterwards she had a big party afterwards. All kinds of food, meats, and tea and coffee. Not any liquor I can remember at all, because in those days liquor hadn't got into the weddings.
They have music?
They have what?
Music?
Yeah, they had a little music, but not much. She wasn't musical, so she didn't have too much music. But I remember one thing she did have, had some very nice cakes. And this is the first time that I never saw it. Half of muskmelon, or a small cantaloupe, cut in two, and the inside dug out and ice cream put in there. And they had homemade ice cream in there, and it was delicious because it was the time when the muskmelons, as we used to call them, were ripe. And somewhere she got enough to serve everybody, an ice cream. And then they had a great time. They had some music afterwards, and they had quite a time getting away because they didn't have any automobiles. But finally they slipped off through the back of the house and around through the orchard and got away. And the people didn't just know when they went. But she lived down near central part of New York. She married a very rich man, and she outlived him and married the second rich man. And I don't know so much about her wedding there. But we did have other entertainments in the home. The home was, as I say, the principal thing in your life, if you had a good home. Now, what did we do in the evenings? We had, to begin with, when I was real small, it was before the time of the radios, before the time of the phonographs, or graphophones, as some of them used to call them. But we did have one thing. Plenty of cards were played in the house, not for money. We never played in our house for any money. We never played on Sunday. But in the evenings, Saturday evenings, we used to play. Usually it was Pedro, a game that four could play or six could play. If you played four, you had a partner. If you played six, you had two partners. And they used to play one set against the other. And I learned to play that, and I learned when I was real young, because father and mother and Florence and I had four of us. We could have a game of cards anytime we wanted to. But usually we had a man working here, a hired man, because father had a big farm, and we had a hired man, sometimes a hired girl, or someone would come in, and then we would have six-handed Pedro, which was much more fun to play six-handed. Now, we wouldn't think of having a game of cards and ending at 9 o'clock unless we had a pan of apples. Usually I was sent down to get a milk pan, a pan 8 or 10 inches, an old milk pan, and we'd bring it up and wash those apples, and we didn't bring up one kind of apple. We had 4 or 5 kinds of apples. We had Baldens, and we had Greenings, we had Kings, and we had Swars, and we had Russets. See, they would pass those around. You could get any kind of apple you wanted out of there. And we used to go to the neighbors because they had some kind of apples that maybe we didn't have. And then, if it was early fall or early winter or late fall, after the cider came, the sweet cider, we always had apples and cider until the cider got a little bit hard, and then they would come bring it up and serve it. Now, besides that, we had card parties where a whole neighborhood, or half the neighborhood, would come and play cards some evenings. That was what they called a card party. And maybe they would set up 5 or 6 little tables, and they would play cards. And sometimes they would play what they call progressive Pedro, where you would start maybe at the bottom or halfway up. And as you won, you moved up one table until you got to the top table. And then at the top table you lost, you went to the bottom and started over again. Those were. Then we had dancing. In the old times, the country people were very fond of dancing. We used to have enough music in the neighborhood, usually, to have a dance. Cal Warren, who lived the next place east of us, that was Mrs. Warren's husband. I used to play the bass viol, and he used to call off. He would call off, and if he couldn't call off, Mrs. Warren could too, so she would rest him once in a while. And then, of course, they had usually someone with a violin. Frank Lund used to play quite a lot there, L-U-N-D, would play. And it was funny, he was left-handed, and seems though he did it pretty awkward, but he could play. And sometimes they used to hire someone to come in. But I couldn't hardly stop without telling about one neighbor here. He was a common farmer, and he was a harder working man, and that was George Snow. He could play the piano. Snow could play classical music, or he could play instrumental and dancing music, Scottish or jigs and things like that. He seemed to have them, and he had never had a sheet of music in front of him. He could just play. You'd tell him what you wanted and he'd play it. He was the ones that we fell back on a great many times.
Now, did your mother have anyone to help her in the home? Did she have a hired girl?
Yes, she did quite a lot of the time. In the summertime, well, she used to have a man nearly all the year round, even in the winter. We had quite a lot of stock, and we had a hired man here all the while in the winter. But in the winter, we seldom had a hired girl. Florence grew up, and she did part of the work. And we didn't have. But in the summertime, when we had extra men besides the one man, well, then we used to have a hired girl, and she would come here. And that lasted until the apple season was over, because in there we used to board the help, always board the help. If there was a man that lived close there, we'd give him a noon dinner, and usually at night. But otherwise, the single man probably was a tramp or somebody, and he came here and worked by the month, and he stayed right here all the while.
Was the hired girl, might she be someone from the neighborhood? Or
yes, usually a neighborhood girl there.
Did they ever hire any from Albion State School?
No. I can remember a plumber girl here, and they had one named Basil that worked here. Usually it was a country girl around here, because they knew what country life and things like that.
Now, were all homes as happy as yours?
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, were there any broken homes?
Very few of them. I don't remember any time when a woman left her husband, or a husband left his wife and children within a mile or two, not in this neighborhood. Mm-hmm. No, there was.
What would have happened to the children? Where would they have been? Would they have stayed with the mother, or would they have been?
It probably stayed with the mother, whoever furnished the home. Mm-hmm. If it was a man and a farmer, she might have went back to her folks and taken the children with him, and he would batch it, if we used to call it. Mm-hmm. He's batching it now, but very seldom. Usually they stuck together. It was the case in those days of, for better or worse, when you married.
Well, were there orphanage, or if there was a disaster in the family, and both parents happened to be killed, would there have been an orphanage that they could have gone to?
Not that I can remember of. There was no orphanage, and there were no deaths where it took both the mother and father away. Usually, if the mother died, the man took them, and he either hired someone to come in to cook for him, and he would stay right there with the children. Or in the case that they had too many, sometimes the younger, if they had a baby or something, the grandmother, one of the grandmothers would take the baby. But if the children were big enough to run around and take care of themselves, he would get a housekeeper, used to call him, and come in and take charge of that until he married again. Now, I can go on a little bit more about the entertainments we had. The entertainments we had in here seemed to me to be the kind that I would like to listen to today. Always in every neighborhood, there was all kinds of people. Some could play the piano, and some was very good talkers, and some of them were very good listeners. But Father was he had traveled quite a little. He'd traveled in Canada and Michigan and Chicago and around. He'd traveled more. In fact, Father was more of a traveler, and he was more of a dealer than he was a farmer, because he could hire a man that would carry on the farm and with his directions, and he would go to Michigan and buy cattle and sheep. But I want to tell you, Father was a good storyteller. And Jenny, but they always called her Jen Stanley, lived right over here just west on the south side in the stone house there where Smith lives today. She lived there, and she was a clipper to tell stories. She was a woman with not very good health, but she was always better when the party come. She was always able to go to the parties, and she one of them. And I want to tell you a story or two that some come from some of these old party storytelling. I want to tell you the story about Fred Pickett. Fred Pickett was an Englishman that lived down on the Kinionville Road. And he got a little money and got his home paid for, and it made him feel pretty good. And he thought he was in the top bracket all the while because he had a home and paid for it, which he was good for a man to come over here. Now, Mr. Pickett and Father had a little disagreement about it, and he got mad at Father. And he said, Mr. Pratt, he says, if yours ever died, he says, I'd be so mad I wouldn't go to your funeral. Now, Father said, Mr. Pickett, I don't feel like that at all, do you? He says, if you died, he said, I'd be happy to go to your picnic.
You mean picnic?
Funeral.
Funeral. I'd go to your funeral. I was thinking that I'd be happy to go to your funeral. I had an uncle down at the Two Bridges. Nobody of you folks don't remember because he died in 1901. He lived to be an old man, and he was one of those that came in here drawn as a probably 2 years old with an ox team from eastern part of New York. He grew up here and got a little education, taught school, owned a farm, and he kept buying more farms, and he became fairly well-to-do. And he owned a farm down at Two Bridges. And he was a rather of a slow-talking man. People would listen because they knew that he had something important to say. When he got old and he didn't farm it anymore, and he dealt in farms and things, buying them and selling them and things. As he gathered money in, he'd buy a farm cheap and sell it to somebody if he was a good worker and start him in farming, and they would pay him interest maybe for 10 or 20 years on that farm. So Uncle John had a farm, and I used to call him, he was really my great-uncle, but I always called him Uncle John. When he got to be old, he had an Irishman working for him there, and he did most of the farm work. He kept a lot of sheep, and he had at one time quite a flock of sheep there, and he had them up in the barnyard, and they were sorting the sheep and the lambs. They were going to separate, they were going to wean the lambs, and they had drove them all in on the barn floor and shut the doors in there, and they had nearly 100 in there. And then they used to take and catch the lambs and sew the lambs out. And when they got the lambs all out, they intended to take those and drive them over to one lot quite far away where the old sheep couldn't hear them blatting, and put them in there, and then drive the sheep somewhere else and separate the sheep. And they were sorting the sheep. There was a couple of men out there putting the lambs out. Grandfather went out. I'll get it right after a while. Uncle John went out there to the barnyard to see what they was doing. And he stood in the door where they put the lambs through to go outside, and he left a crack in the door. And Pat, the Irishman, said, Mr. Pratt, he says, come in and shut the door. He said, they'll be getting out. And no, he said, I will see that they don't get out. And everything went all right for 2 or 3 minutes, and finally one of those old sheep had lost her lamb, saw the light there, and she made a bolt, and she went right between my uncle's legs, opened the door, and the sheep all run out and mixed in with the lambs again. My uncle was knocked right over on his back out in the where rather sheep manure, and the sheep run over him, some of them, and they cut his face, and his face bled, and he got up on his feet. Pat looked at him and said, now, you damned old fool, you see what you've done? Uncle never said a word. He turned and went in the house without saying one word. And when he got in there, his wife Hannah saw him coming in. His face was all blood and he was all sheep manure. And she said, "John, what's the matter? What's the matter?" He didn't say anything for a minute. And then he spoke up. "Hannah, Patrick says I'm a damned old fool." Patrick is right. Do we want any more? All right, there's many other things the old house had which were not so important today. Many of us in the old houses like this one had cisterns. That furnished us with the soft water. You had the hard water or the drinking water came from the well on the outside of the house, carried in by a pail, usually by the boy, if they had one. And the cistern was down below part of the cellar, and the water from the eave troughs run down into the cistern. That was plastered up and held the water, and with a pump they would soon have cistern water. That cistern water, as we called it, was soft water, and it took less soap, and it was good to wash clothes and dishes in, so we always had a good supply. And then we had another pail for the drinking water, which we put in the tea kettle to make our tea and to cook our meats and things like that in. So the cistern was really important, because we had no electricity to pump the water into the house as is done today from far outside. Another thing that was joined to the house.
Just a minute, Mr. Pratt. Can you tell us that you said was put in the tea kettle to boil the water? What did you heat the water on?
We heat the water on the cook stove, which was usually fired by wood. Sometimes in the winter we had coal in there in the winter time, but in the summertime it was always wood, and you had the amount of fire according to the fire that you kept in there.
Then how did you heat the rainwater?
How did you heat the rainwater? The back of the cook stove had a reservoir on there, and we used to fill that, and that was yours truly job part of the time to keep that rainwater tank filled in the stove, and then you had warm water to cook. But usually the tea kettle was kept filled. That was one of the things the mother said. Never forget your tea kettle. Always have some water in your tea kettle.
Did they ever use this cistern for to prevent a fire in case of a little
No,
fire?
we seldom had that. We used to use the well water for that. Our well water was right here at the corner of the house, and so it was be handier there. No, but something else that was connected pretty close to the house, and that was the old toilet. Most of them had a little house on the back part, either 2 or 3 hole toilet out there. Usually with the door facing away from the road. But we had one woman that wanted the door to face the road so she could see who was going by. And that held on until the time that we had water pumped into the house, and then we could have water pressure and have a toilet and things like that. That didn't come until electricity came along, which was a good many years later.
What did you use for toilet paper?
Use what?
For toilet paper.
Usually some thin paper if we had it, tissue paper. If we had it, thin newspaper would do the job.
Did you ever use a Sears and Roebuck catalog?
Yes, that was a good thing. Probably lots of them went out of this world through the toilet out there. Yes. They were sweet things if you caught at night, and especially if it was cold in the wintertime. Ours was quite a ways out, and you'd take a lantern and run out there and sit up against the west wind. Well, we have barber shops in our home too, because mother or father always cut our hair. Father would cut my hair sometimes, and sometimes the mother would cut it. But then the father needed his hair cut, it was up to mother to cut it. And that's the way we got through. We had no movies at this time, but we did have piano music. My sister learned to play music, play the piano. She got to be quite a artist with the piano, and she furnished us his music. And if we have time, why, maybe we'll have a little of that music sometime. No silent movies. They did have early phonographs, they used to call them phonographs, on round cylinders. And Mr. Warren, our neighbor next one, was the first one had. He had as many as 100, and he would bring them up, and they would have music on there. That was our first music. And of course, at later time, it developed, and they had the early radio. I can remember the first radio I ever had in here, or the first one that I had, was what they called crystal sets. You would put the receiver up to your ear, and you would put your little wire on this chunk of crystal. And if you got everything to work just right, you would hear from far away places. I can remember hearing Madame Schumann on one of the very first ones. She was a noted German singer, and she sang over a station from Pittsburgh, and we could get that over the radio. And that's the first one. And then, of course, they developed, and we got a bigger one where you had a horn, and you could listen, and didn't have to have earphones to it. Those are some of the things we've grown into there, that we've found things developing all through my life, especially in the electric visions of the future. Small stores. We did not have too many stores around here. We went to Eagle Harbor and traded at a country store there a great deal. And sometimes we went to Albin, but all the stores. I can remember when the A&P first started in Albin, on East Bank Street on the north side there, in a store. It was very small, probably 20 feet wide and 30 feet long would be the size of the A&P stores. That turned into the chain stores. They kept moving and getting larger stores and developing different parts of the store. In the olden times, if you wanted any meat, you went into a different store, and there they would cut you off the meat. Sometimes they would go into the cold room there and bring out a quarter of beef and cut off whatever you wanted to. Lay it down in a big block and saw it off, and you could have the beef any size you wanted to, a roast, or they would cut off steak in that times. Father had quite a lot of cattle, and he always used to have cattle killed in the fall. We had a slaughterhouse here, and I could tell you a lot about that. But we had, when the cold weather come, there was a beef animal killed, and in the barn we had meat, and our meat market was the dry barn, because the meat could freeze up, and I could go out there with a saw and saw off steak or something to cook.
In the stores, now how did they keep the room cold?
They had ice. Chunks of ice in there. They had a ice house somewheres and put in great big squares. Sometimes they'd be 2 feet long, a foot thick and 2 feet wide. And they would have 8 or 10 of those cakes in there to keep the air cool. And that would keep the milk in. We did have windmills. That in those olden times. We did not have a windmill here, but during some of the neighbors did. Up the road, my aunt and uncle up there had a windmill. And when I was real small, they pumped water into the house, from the well into the house, and they had a great big tank in there that you could almost go in swimming in, probably to hold 500 gallons of water. And the water was pumped into there while it was cold from the well. And then it ran from there, by gravity, it ran out into the barn there by gravity and ran out there where the cattle could get the water out there. We had no broom makers. The broom makers had vanished from this part of the country when I was a boy, but they used to come through here at different times in the summertime with a whole little wagon or a double surrey-like wagon and selling brooms. And we also had tin peddlers coming here with their wagon. We had grocery peddlers. And of course we had gypsies coming through here. I was always afraid of the gypsies. Someone had told me that they stole little boys and carried them off. And that caused me to go to where I couldn't be seen. But I later found that the gypsies didn't do that. They come along and want to tell your fortune and steal the silverware off your table if they could. If they got a chance, they would tell your fortune for a quarter and probably steal half a dollar's worth.
For the Orleans County Historical Association, August 6, 1980. Mrs. Ruth Applegate of Albion, New York, is interviewing J. Howard Pratt of Gaines, New York. This is tape number 2 with Howard Pratt and Ruth Applegate.
Mr. Pratt, you were going to say something about the peddlers, the rag peddler?
Yes, in those olden days we had many rag peddlers or rag pickers. They weren't pickers, they were peddlers. But they bought your rags. They would pay you money only if you would not accept fruit or some other thing, small thing in pay. They hated to give out the money. So usually they got it by so much for the rags, and now I'll sell you so much fruit, or little good-for-nothing things that they had. I can remember Mother taking pineapple, especially because the pineapple was hard to get, and then they very seldom had any in the stores. And so she used to take rags, money, and trade for, well, maybe tinware or pineapples or something like that. Other things that we had to buy and sell in some different ways. We knew what it was to barter. That is to trade our eggs for our groceries, or trade our eggs for with a man that furnished the meat peddler come along, and he would take eggs usually. Another thing that you were missing today is the fly stickers. We used to have lots of flies, 10 times as many as you have today, and we used to drive them out. And then they would darken the room, put a cheesecloth over the dining room table, and the butter was taken downstairs, and the flies driven out, and the room darkened, then the flies won't come in again. If in a dark room, they won't come in there very much. And that's the way we got rid of them. But then we did have those that came in when you opened up for noon or for night, and we used to have fly stickers, which was little pieces of paper, strips about 2 or 3 inches wide and probably 3 feet long or 4, and they were all rolled up, and when you got them you would pull them out and it looked like molasses, sticky stuff, sweetened because flies like sugar. And then they had those fly stickers, and they would put them around up over the table, and the flies would bring around the table, fly around that and get caught in there. And then when the thing got full, I used to throw it out, and burn it, and put some more fresh fly paper up. Or another thing they had was poison for flies, which was a poison and they used to have in a shallow dish. And it was sweetened with sugar. And the flies would get in there to eat the sugar. Syrup is always attract flies, and they would get some of the poison and die that way. Albin, just west of Albin there, where the Eagle Harbor Road strikes the canal and bends south. And that's house that old Mike Dolan used to live there. And he used to come along about once a month. And he was a tin peddler. He had all kinds of tinware to sell. And he was a sharp old Irishman. And he used to open up the doors and show all his things. Usually Mother went out and she bought things of Mr. Dolan. And you would hear him coming and he would ring a bell before he got to your house. And then he'd get up to the house, the horse would stop, and he would ring the bell just a little until you got out there, and then he would sell you whatever you wanted in the tinware. Mother used to buy pans and things, milk pans and little tin dishes and things of him. And then he used to go to the house across the road there.
Did he used to sharpen shears too?
I don't remember that he did. Mm-hmm. There was people that come along and sharpened all kinds of shears and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think. And I remember those, so one of them came along here, but not very often. And he had a sort of wheelbarrow, and he had a grindstone in that wheelbarrow. And he would set that down and turn the grinder and sharpen your shears. Then we had the grocery peddlers. We had several grocery peddlers, but the one that we traded the most with was Walter's Brothers at Eagle Harbor. They had a two-horse team, and usually there would be two of them on a wagon. Leon Walters was a boy about my age, or a little bit younger, and he used to come along and drive the horses for his Uncle Will Walters. And they used to have all kinds of things. They would buy eggs. He came along here late in the afternoon. He'd made quite a big circle, and we was headed back towards Eagle Harbor when he got here. And I can remember a car carrying out baskets of eggs, 2, 3, 4, 5 dozen eggs. And we would take those eggs out there, and the mother would buy groceries. And if they didn't come out even, why, he'd put it down on the book that he owed us or we owed him. In the fall sometimes, when the apple pickers came and we got lots of groceries, we used to get behind. And then Father went over there afterwards, after the apple pickers had finished, and maybe we'd have a grocery bill of $50. And that would be for all summer, though, from there. He would also take butter. He would take butter. If you made good butter, he would take the butter. Or he would sell the butter if you was out of butter. He would sell you butter. But he had everything, spools and needles and things like that, sugar, spices, anything like that to sell. But sometimes he was nearly closed out time he got here, and we couldn't get everything sometimes.
Okay. Did you ever go trapping, Mr. Pratt?
Yes, I was a trapper when I was young because pennies were scarce in any way to get a little money. My father didn't give me a great deal of money for my work. Probably I ate more than my work was worth anyway. So I became a trapper. I never hunted with a gun and shot too many things, but I did trap. When the fall came on, we say the fur isn't good until there's a R in the month's name, and so September, the latter part of September, and get into October when the weather was colder, then the fur was, we used to say, thicker, and it was worth more. And then we could, I used to trap muskrat a great deal over the creek just to the south of us, and I used to have maybe 2 dozen traps strung out there, and every day I would go through there early in the morning, just about daylight, and look at the traps. And usually the muskrats, I set the stake out in the water and they would drown themselves. If they doesn't, why I would have to kill them with a stick. And then I would come home, sometimes with not any, and sometimes I would have 2 or 3. And then I had the fun of, or the work of skinning them. We used to cut from the 2 hind legs back across them and pull the hide down towards their head and skin as we went along down. And that gave us a rectangular shaped pelt, muskrat hide. And then we had a pointed stick, usually made out of a thin board, a half an inch board or less. And it was sharp down to a point on one end. And then it gradually widened as it went back. And till they got back of the front legs, and then it was nearly parallel until then. They were anywhere from 3 to 6 inches wide, according to the size of the muskrat. I got that, and then after a while, when I got the rats pretty well cleaned up over there, I used to hunt skunks, and that was quite a thing. But I got so that I could tell pretty near where the skunks lived. And then, if anyone had a dead hen anywheres around, I used to hunt out the neighbors' dead hens and take and cut them in two and use them for bait for to catch the skunks. And then you'd catch the skunks. And how to catch the skunk and dispatch with his life before he give you a shot was the big trick. And usually they were caught in a hole or near a hole, and they'd be in that hole. And when you pulled them, they would come out head first. And that was the time you had to stick all poised up in the air ready. And when you see his head out, that stick must drop down and kill him or make him senseless before the hind parts come out, because that's the time they were going to plaster you. When the skunk come out and he threw his tail up over his back, you better take to the woods.
Did you ever get sprayed?
Oh yes, lots of times. I got sprayed. I got sprayed more than once. And then the folks would know when I got near home. They would smell me for it. And the skunks were very common at times. I went out here one fall, and I wasn't hunting skunks then, and right out here in the front yard, right here between here and the road, I met 2 skunks right out here. They were around. They're not afraid of people. They're not afraid of people. They'll come right up to you.
How did he throw the hides?
And the skunks depended on how much black there was on them. If there was not hardly any, if there was just a little star of white on the head and the rest of them was black, they would be the top price, and they would be worth anywhere from $2.50 to $3 in those olden times. And if they had a wide strip of white down from their head to the back end there, they wouldn't be worth more than less than $1, 75 cents sometimes.
Now, going back a little ways, after you got the hide on the board, what did you do with it?
What would you tack it on there, and so it would harden on there. And after a while, the fat was all taken off in the hide, and the hide would dry down. And after a while, it gets so dry that it would pull off from the board, and it wouldn't shrink at all. It would stay right in that shape. If it was the shape of this here, you pull it off, it would be that shape.
Like an envelope.
It would be shaped like an envelope with it's pointed down like this. Here would be his head in here, and it would be that shape. And this would stay right there, just like an empty envelope.
Then what would you do with them?
Then we would, when we got quite a few hides of the rats and the the skunk, and say I want to tell you, once I caught a mink. Now the mink is a small animal, and they're hard to catch, and they're very scarce, and it's hard to catch them. They're just foxy. But I set for what I thought was going to be a muskrat, and mink traveled overland quite a ways, a quarter of a mile or half a mile, and got into that trap, and I caught him, and he was worth $10. And I thought that was a big thing. It was a nice, good-sized mink, and they were very high at that time. That's the only real good thing. But I have gathered quite a few dollars in the fall, and you could also trap again in the spring. When you had quite a number of skins, probably mixed ones, and sometimes we'd catch a coon and the coon skins, but they weren't quite as pricely. They didn't bring quite so much, and they were what we call open skin. We seldom put those on a stretcher. We open them up through the belly, and it'd be a flat skin. We'd nail it on the barn or something and dry it out, and we'd sell it. And then a dealer would come along, and he would offer you so much for your rats, and so much for the mink, and so much for the skunks and things like that. He would grade it. And usually the fall rats were cheap. 10 cents, 12, 15 cents for the fall rats. In the spring, they would be worth, those same muskrats in the spring would be worth from 20 to 25 cents. The skunk did not change as much, and I never caught any foxes. They were too foxy for me. I've seen them, but we never caught any.
Will you tell us again, Mr. Pratt, how old you were?
Well, this month I'm 91 years old. This month.
And I understand that you've done a lot of traveling.
Well, yes. In the last 8 years, my wife has been dead 8 years, and I couldn't go anywhere because she was an invalid for a number of years, and I couldn't go anywhere. And I've always liked to travel. My foot, I guess, is itchy, and so I started traveling after that. And I've been across the water, across the ocean 6 times in the last 7 years. I didn't go one other year back, and I didn't go this year. But if the Lord's willing gives me the strength, I'm going next year again, and I'll probably go to Ireland for the most of my stay.
Now, why do you like Ireland?
Well, I like Ireland better than I do England, because the people of Ireland are much more cordial. They're your friend right away, and they think more of you than the people of England do. The people of England, a few of them, I can't forget that we beat them in war twice, and they don't like a bloody Englishman, a bloody American over there. So I like the Irish better. They're easier to talk to. They will go out of their way to do things for you. I fell in love with Ireland when you ask a man how far it was down to a certain church that you wanted to go to. Oh, and he says, and sure, I'll go that way myself, he says, and show you that. And he'll go out of his way to teach you where to go. And it's easy to get along in Ireland.
And now, where were some of the places that you listed?
Well, I've been nearly all over Ireland. The first time I went there, we landed at Shannon, and on a tour. And that tour will take you, they have it all planned out, to where you stay each night and where you'll go from one place to place. It's a good way the first time to go over there is to go on a tour, because your time is all used to good advantage, and you can go just where you want to. But you cannot stay as long as you want to. If you're very fond of some Irish girl or man, you can't stay there, because the next day they'll take you off and you'll be 100 or 50 miles farther off. But we have a great many places of beauty in Ireland, especially in the western. We landed in Shannon and went south. Shannon down to the little villages there. Well, we went north to Galway, and we was there a little while, and then we went to Connemara. But these are only names to you. Connemara is where they make a great many rings, jewelry of all kinds from the stones and things that they grind there. The better part of Ireland to see is around Killarney. Many songs of Killarney, and we were there, I think, 3 days. And then you go from Killarney around Dingle Bay one day, and you'll go up one side of the bay and down the other. And as you go along Dingle Bay, I thought I was nearer heaven than I was ever again will be, because we was above Dingle Bay, and we looked down onto the water there about 100 feet below us, and the water from the Atlantic was coming in there, blue and things, and breaking on the shore. And mountain behind us, and back of me was one of the Irish with 4 or 5 figures in the cross, and their religion was back there, a little place to pray. And it seems though that was as near heaven as I ever got to be. Then you come back and you stay in Killarney all night. And I will have to tell you, when the first time I went over to Ireland, I went on a tour, and I was all alone. I went alone. I didn't know much about the tour. Usually there's 2 of them who will go together. They won't go alone. They'll have someone. I was just ignorant enough to go alone. There was nobody here from New York State, only somebody, a lady from New York City. I knew nobody on there. I got on board and there was 44 other people, myself made 45. They were from California, Florida, a lot of them from the New England states, and this woman from there, and I was a perfect stranger to every one of them. And in the first 2 days I learned that I was kind of a little puppy running behind, and wasn't anyone paying much attention to me, or they didn't know me or anything. So I made up my mind. I said, well, I know how to break the ice. So I said that night I made up my plan, and I told the man, our guide, I says the next morning we start out about 9 to 9:30. I says when you get out there and loading the bus, I will be the last one out there. I says I'm going to linger behind, but don't worry, I'll be out there. But I want everybody on the bus when I get on the bus. So I took, before I went out, I did a little changing. I took off my glasses, and I got a Band-Aid that I was carrying, and I put it over one of my eyes like that, and I got an old green cap that I hadn't been wearing, and I put that on. And I said, when they all got on there, it was this coach, chartered bus was just outside a little ways. I said, I stumbled out there, and as I went up the steps of that, I made a lot of noise, still as if I was drunk and stumbling up there. And when I got up there, I looked around and I said, oh, Paddy dear, and did you hear the news that's going around? The shamrock is forbid by law to grow on Irish ground. St. Patrick's Day no more will keep, his colour can't be seen, for there's a bloody law again, the wearing of the green. And I went down the aisle. My seat happened to be almost in the back. And I went down and I would look up in their face and stagger up in the face, and I'd go to the other side and look up in the face, those there. And I went, as I went down, in the second verse, oh, I met with Tapper Handy, and I shook him by the hand. And how is old Ireland, and how does she stand? She's the most distressful country that ever you have seen. They're hanging men and women there for wearing of the green. And before I could sit down, I turned to, there was 2 ladies over there, and I'd been out for the night before to them. They were Italians from Connecticut, but I got a little bit acquainted with them, and I said, and then sure I wouldn't have got home at all if it hadn't been for 2 good-looking women who took me by the arm and led me home. They hadn't done that, but did their face get red. And then I took down and took off my cap, took off this thing off my eye, and sat down. And the woman in the seat in front of me, she said, I didn't know you, she said. She turned around to the seat in front of me. She said, I didn't know you. And I told my husband, he said, if he's a panhandler, don't give him anything. And after that, everyone knew me. They would go in the table in the morning for breakfast there. They would say, hey, Pratt, come over here and eat breakfast with us. I got acquainted with everybody just by doing that trick. That's
Did
what.
you, excuse me, did you ever stay, did you always stay in hotels and?
Oh wait, I did yes, the first 2 times I went, I always stayed in hotels. They were nice hotels, some of them. The Great Southern Hotel in Killarney, we were in there. That's one of the best hotels. But it's probably the biggest and probably the best and oldest ones. And they stayed some of the best hotels in London. In Edinburgh, I never was in a hotel like that in all my life. It's only been open 2 months. New, everything was so new there in Edinburgh. A new hotel. They took us to good hotels. And when we went over there, a hotel overnight, you'd get your breakfast, you'd get your supper or dinner, and overnight, and your breakfast for $20 to $25. And we got it for I figured out about half that in those nice hotels. Yes, those times I did, but when I went on alone, I went in a different way. I went to bed and breakfast. No.
What does that mean?
A bed and breakfast means usually people are on their own. You go wherever you want. I went over there the second time I was over to Ireland. I stayed a week. The rest of the crew come home. The other 44 came home, and I stayed right there in Ireland and came home the next week when they was taking some people. The next group would come along a week later, and I joined that group and came home. That gave me a week, and then I learned to go bed and breakfast. You go along the street near the station, and you'd see a little sign, bed and breakfast, or B&B. That means they will give you a bed and a breakfast.
In a private home?
In a private home. They're all private homes. You look for them in the private homes, and then you can go in there and ask them, you got a room for one? How many of you? They'll ask you. And then they'll say, well, I'm alone. Well, I've got one single, or maybe I haven't got any. You go out the next door, or you go down here, someplace, and you'll find that's the bed and breakfast system. And they don't cost too much. In our money, that means when I was there, probably they're up a little bit now. Anywhere from $3.50 to $5 for bed and breakfast. And they're nice. They're clean. And you get a good breakfast. And food is cooked nice. And you get in the cooking that the regular Irish have, and not the extra things that you'll get in the plush hotels.
Mr. Pratt, when I first met you, I was a girl of about 12, whose name was Ruth Fain, and I met you at Eagle Harbor School. Country school. And I was in 7th grade. I had you in 7th and 8th grade. Do you remember?
Yes, I remember you in the 7th grade there. At that time I was teaching the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And I remember you very plainly. You was a nice little girl, and you were some of my older scholars, and getting ready to take some of the regents to enter high school. And I think probably I passed you and got you through the things into high school. Any other things you remember about going to school to me over there?
Well, I remember now in my 8th grade, I had to go over to high school to take regents, and you prepared me very well to do the regents, and I took arithmetic, reading, English, geography, yes, spelling, yes, and then in 8th grade you always gave us a little bit more. We had about a half year of algebra in our 8th grade.
Yes, I prepared them because it's a big jump from arithmetic to algebra, and it's hard if they don't. When I started in algebra, the class had been in session 3 weeks, and I was way behind. I didn't know beans about it, and teacher said I didn't. know anything about it. And I had hard work hanging on. But after a while, and I said, my children are never going to get into trouble like that. So I started them in very easily, and it made it a lot easier for algebra, taking up algebra in high school.
It surely did. I know algebra was easy for me, and it was from the start I got with you. And one, I remember one time hearing you say that you had 100% passing, and it never dawned on me until later years that certainly you had 100% passing, because I was the only one that year that took Regents. Now, thank you very much, Mr. Pratt, for this interview with you. It's been delightful. And don't pull any tricks like going up on the roof and falling off again.